Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me. And thank you to Motovila for inviting me to speak to you today. I'm sorry not to be with you in person, but it isn't possible for two reasons. First, I am running a big event tomorrow here in Scotland. But more pertinently, as you'll gather from what I am going to say, the stories we tell, with our actions as well as our words, are important. And it would tell the wrong story if I travelled to Slovenia from Scotland, even by train, to join a short conference. The title I was given for this talk was, "What do we talk about when we talk about carbon literacy?" But I'm going to say, let's not talk first about carbon literacy. Carbon literacy suggests a certain technical or understanding or a knowledge of carbon, but we are artists, not technicians or scientists. So we will come back to carbon literacy when we need to. Let's talk first about climate change. But as an aside, some people in both the artistic and the climate change worlds may say, why should artists talk about climate change? It's not their area, they're already overworked and under-resourced, and they can't help. Let me first deal with this question, because it is an important one. First, for the cultural world, we must reduce our carbon emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change, just like the rest of society. The EU and other national and local governments are putting this into law and regulations to meet the international target of net zero and to manage the enormous changes that are happening to our climate. Art and culture aren't above this challenge. In fact, I would suggest that health and agriculture, to name just two, are more likely to be allocated the last tons of carbon to be emitted than theatre or dance. So we need to get with the project. And this isn't a constraint. We can build it into what we do and make better art because of it. The best artists have always responded imaginatively to the biggest questions that society has faced, and audiences have looked to them for knowledge and inspiration. For the climate change world, I say that culture can help you. Our emissions are not high, but our influencing power is. And the need to influence society is increasingly recognised by climate change professionals. The event I am running tomorrow will be addressed by the Cabinet Secretary for Energy and Climate Change in Scotland. At Creative Carbon Scotland, we have worked with climate change economists and adaptation specialists to develop an innovative adaptation strategy for Glasgow City region, which has around the same population as Slovenia. Our projects are funded by both the Cultural and Climate Change Directorates at the Scottish Government. Culture featured strongly at COP26, for reasons which I think will become clear as I speak. As a film we made for COP says, climate action needs culture. Aside over, let's now talk about climate change. And as I said before, we are artists, not scientists. So when we talk about climate change, let's talk about it from our point of view. I'll look first at the second of these words, change. If there's one thing the global north has learned about global heating in the last year, it is that it is about change. The impacts of climate change have suddenly become clear to people who perhaps didn't think they needed to worry about it. Fires, unbearable, even unlivable in temperatures, droughts and floods. The world around us is changing fast and we need to respond. If we don't, we'll die, either literally as humans or metaphorically as organisations. In the arts up to now, the climate change talk, if it happened at all, has mostly been about carbon reduction, carbon literacy, if you like. But it also needs to be about adaptation. How will climate change affect your organisation? In Scotland, this is most likely to be about making sure your building, if you have one, is resistant to much more rain, higher humidity, very high winds and occasionally very heavy snow. But it also matters to mobility. When a big snowstorm happened in the UK and Ireland in March 2018, whole festivals were cancelled because all artists and audiences couldn't get to the venues. In the UK this summer, planes were delayed and trains had to go slowly because the runways had melted and the railway lines were buckling because of the heat. Imagine if your opera singer needed to get to you on one of those planes. What difference have the changes you have experienced in Slovenia made to your operations this summer? This is going to happen again, and it is going to get more frequent and more severe. And the cultural organisations that adapt to this reality effectively will be the ones that survive. So now is the time to think about it. We have a good, cool toolkit to help you do this. Go to culturaladaptations.com/toolkits, where the Adapting Our Culture toolkit is free to download. The adaptation is not all about risk management. It is also about seeing new opportunities. In Scotland, warmer summers may mean that more outdoor shows and activities become possible for arts organisations. And maybe if it is going to be very warm in Slovenia, arts organisations with buildings should think about shifting their programme towards the cooler months to reduce their cooling and ventilation costs, just as one theatre in Newcastle in England decided to move their dance programme towards the summer, as the higher temperatures that dancers need required less energy to achieve in the warmer months. And there may be other opportunities in becoming havens for people when it is very cold, very wet, very warm, becoming, if you like, society's friend in a climate emergency. This could strengthen bonds and loyalty with your audiences, bring new people into your venues, and maybe provide different things to talk about with your art. Now let's look at that word climate, and again, let's look at it as artists, metaphorically rather than scientifically. The climate is certainly changing, not just meteorologically, but also economically and culturally. President Macron of France said the other week that the age of abundance is over. He's been criticised for implying that we've all had lots of abundance, whilst of course the reality is that some countries and some people in some countries have had much more abundance than others. But it is broadly true that for the global north, the past few decades have been in a period of extraordinary richness and extraordinary consumption. And that consumption is at heart the source of climate change. Global consumption really took off in the 1980s with the development of cheap international transport, the loosening of capital controls, and, it sounds silly but it's true, the invention of the shipping container a couple of decades earlier. And the figures show that climate change really took off around the same point. Around the same time. Since 1992, humanity has emitted more greenhouse gases than in all the years up to that point. Those of us who can afford it, and this probably does include many of you at the conference today, and it certainly includes me and my colleagues in the UK, we have been addicted to fossil fuels, which not only provide our energy, but also our fertiliser, our travel and transport, and the raw materials for many of the goods we consume. The arts world does a lot of travel, for example, far more today than when I started out in the mid-1980s. The war in Ukraine and the post-pandemic inflation are swiftly bringing that age of abundance to a halt, at least for most of us. So the economic climate has suddenly changed, and the cultural climate is changing too. This inflationary period aligns with a recognition that such consumption is wrecking the world. Society and the arts has changed too. When I set up Creative Carbon Scotland in 2011, I was nervous about talking about art to cultural organisations. Most of the climate change theatre that I had seen hadn't been much good, and I, as a former theatre director myself, knew that there was a sensitivity about issue-based art. I didn't, and I don't really agree with this. Much of the great art in history has been produced to forward one end or another, whether that be to worship a god, to please a patron, or in the shape of both Brecht and Shakespeare, two playwrights I admire greatly, to comment on politics. Arguably, most great Western European art has been produced for a purpose. I feared that artists and artistic directors felt they didn't want to produce didactic work, that audiences wouldn't be interested. But that has changed, and if I was starting now, I would be much more open about the need to change not only how we make art, but also the art we make. More and more artists are making work that touches upon climate change, and some of it is very good indeed. Some, admittedly, is still awful, but that's life. And there's no doubt that the most important thing the arts and cultural sectors can do is use their enormous influence to change society, to work through artists, through the work they make and present, and through the communication they have with loyal audiences, to help shift society to genuinely addressing climate change. By this, I don't mean that artists should be drafted in to communicate climate change better than the scientists, which is what's often said. I know from my own work that a work of art takes its own shape and root, and any decent artist will find it difficult to steer it back to a preordained communication topic. When people think about the role of art in addressing climate change, there is often too much focus on the individual audience member being changed by some transformational moment in a theatre, or gallery, or with a book, and therefore their behaviour and lifestyle being changed. I believe art does two quite different things. First, it promotes and facilitates collective thinking about difficult topics. And second, it helps society itself to think and think better. When you go to a play, a concert, to a museum or a gallery, even in some ways when you read a book, you are setting time aside in your busy week to travel and to spend that time thinking about something that someone knowledgeable has asked you to think about, and is providing you with the structure, materials, information and so on to do so. And more important, all those other people who are there, or other people who have read, are reading, or will read that book, are doing the same thing. A community of people is created, albeit for a short time. Your minds are working together. You behave differently together, you think together. Any theatre person listening will know that an audience together is cleverer, quicker, more astute than the individual separately. You need to work hard to keep ahead of them, or they get bored. And this collective thinking is what we need to address climate change. Individuals making individual changes aren't going to get us to where we need to be in carbon reduction or adaptation. Communities and society need to make some big collective decisions. So art can help bring people together to think together, to be cleverer together, and to make some tough decisions together. It's not doing the communicating, that way bad art lies, but it is doing the thing that art has always done. It is making us think. There's a negative side to this too. There's a great storyteller and researcher in Edinburgh that we've worked with, Alette Willis, who said at an event I was at that we live in a soup of stories. We live by stories. And this crystallized something I had been thinking about for some time. The stories we tell ourselves, the stories we hear and tell others, shape us and shape our lives. And we've been telling stories about or set within consumption and high carbon lifestyle for decades. Why then would we be surprised if the lifestyles we aspire to and the society we live in are high carbon, climate destroying ones? We know that Hollywood pumps out a diet of films to promote the capitalism that makes America what it is, and it works. I'd suggest that if we continue to tell the stories in our theatre, our literature, our music, our visual art, our films, our everything, then we won't change society, we won't change the world. We need to change the stories we tell. And that is why the climate change world needs culture, because so far they and we haven't been changing the stories by which we all live. Now, I've spoken about some of the change that we're experiencing and that which is needed, and I've spoken about how the climate is changing in all sorts of metaphorical ways. But you also want me to talk about carbon literacy, because almost by chance, I happened down the road that you are now embarked on a few years ago. I want to stress that. This is mostly about experience, not about any special knowledge that I had before I started. Back in 2008, I was a theatre director until I had a midlife crisis, if you like, and decided to do a master's degree in carbon management. We set up Creative Carbon Scotland after that. A little bit here about that. Creative Carbon Scotland is successful, I think, because we are trusted. I came from the arts. I had worked for 25 years in theatre and music and had run theatres, companies and art centres. I was joined by the Edinburgh Festivals, the Federation of Scottish Theatre and the Scottish Contemporary Art Network. People knew me, and they knew those who set up the charity with me, and they knew that we knew what they were dealing with, as well as about carbon management. So we had strong support from the cultural sector. And we had support too from the funding body Creative Scotland, where a very foresightful woman on the senior management team took a risk and provided enough money to get us started. And then when she left, a colleague of hers, also on the senior management team, took it on as his responsibility. So it has been a bottom-up and a top-down thing. The sector was supporting change and the funding body was too. and you need both. And so I say to those of you listening who work for the local or the national government, for funding bodies, and to those of you who work in arts organisations, all of you need to provide some leadership. Take a risk, whether you're at the top or at the bottom. Another success factor is I think that we are very positive. I am a long-term pessimist, but a short-term optimist. No matter how bleak the long-term future looks, and it sometimes looks pretty bleak, I wake up in the morning thinking that I can make the world better for people today. At Creative Carbon Scotland, we provide what I call a scaffolding. People didn't start working in the arts to worry about climate change. So when we ask them to learn something new, to make some changes to what they do, they need to know that we will make it as easy for them as possible. And that if they get it wrong, they won't fall, but they'll be protected by the scaffolding, as when people are when they're working on a building site. There's always a safety net. And finally, in the very quick tour of how we got started in Scotland, we have always worked with the people who want to work with us, and I have never worried about the people who don't want to. They will realise sooner or later that everyone else is having a good time at that party over there, and they'll decide to join us. I completed my MSc in carbon management back in 2010. I now know a fair bit about carbon management. I'm carbon literate, you might say. And one thing I've learned is that you can worry too much about carbon. We need to measure our greenhouse gas emissions, but we measure them only to bring about change. The numbers themselves are of limited use. It is easy, and there are many calculators and methodologies that encourage this, to spend lots of time and energy and worry getting very accurate about your emissions. But unless you make change happen on the basis of that information, it is wasted time. Really, you need to know where your main emission sources are, i.e. what is causing the emissions, and the relative importance of them in your activity. This is slightly more complex than it sounds, but the first stages are easy. And let me clear one thing up. There's often a lot of worry about materials and recycling. But unless you are a very unusual cultural organisation, it is energy and travel where the biggest challenges lie. You should start working on those first. Most of you listening will work for an organisation or in a field that either owns or manages a building, or it operates in one which somebody else owns or manages. If you are the building manager, I am pretty sure that your main source of emissions is from your electricity use and your gas or other fuels used to heat the building, cook food, etc. If you rent space from someone else and they pay for and control the utilities, then the chances are, in the cultural sector, your main emissions will come from travel and transport, either your own, your artists or other people you pay to work for you, or potentially things you move around. In both of your cases, buildings and non-buildings, the audience travel may also be important. If you are controlling the utilities, you need to know much more detail. When is energy being used, and is it always necessary? What is that electricity powering overnight when nobody is in the building? Could you turn off most of the fridges in the bar when it is closed and only keep the ones on which contain food or drink that will spoil? You also need to think about who owns the energy, who makes the decisions about when a room is being used that requires heating or cooling or lighting. Are they thinking about the energy use when they make that decision? Or is that problem left to the poor building manager who doesn't get a say in programming but has to deal with the carbon and financial budgets which the program affects? So carbon literacy here is not so much about the science, the numbers, which are pretty straightforward, but it is about how carbon is emitted in practice, how your organisation does that. When it comes to travel and transport, the questions are similar. Who is travelling and is it necessary? Who makes the decisions? Travel-related emissions are harder to measure because there are so many different people travelling and paying for it in different ways. You may buy an artist a ticket, or they sort it out and include it in the fee they charge. Other people use petty cash, invoices, credit cards. But it may well be a large part of your carbon footprint, so it is worth doing the work. My tip, make sure internal staff track their travel and their emissions in their expenses claims, and make sure your contracts with external artists and others require them to provide the information. It may not be super accurate, but it will give you a sense of the total travel. We have a tool claimexpenses.com, and you can take a free tour which may help a bit. It is set up for the UK and so uses our conversion factors for mileage to emissions and so on, but it will give you an idea of what information is useful to collect. Audience travel can also be a big source of emissions. Finding out where your audience have come from, whether for this performance or this festival, and how they travelled, can be complex, but you can use regular surveys to build up a picture and do some estimation, and it may prove to be even more than your internal travel, if you like. And this is one area where the metaphorical climate may need to change too. Over my life in the arts, cultural tourism has become a big thing, and the arts have been seen as a major economic driver. Much funding has been provided in order that we bring about economic benefits. Now, I live in Edinburgh, which has a big cultural tourism industry, and even before the pandemic, there was growing concern that the city was becoming too popular with tourists. It was losing its character, and life was growing problematic for us Edinburghers, and even the character that made people want to come to Edinburgh was perhaps being lost. It was just too busy. Airbnb was taking over places where people used to live. You know the story. And then the pandemic hit, which did away with all of that for a time. But it also demonstrated that in these changing times, cultural tourism is a sugly peg, as we say in Scotland, on which to hang your economic future. It doesn't take much for people to be unable to travel or not to want to. There is now a shift towards seeing the arts and culture in a more rounded way and emphasising their social benefits. And this is another less recognised way in which culture can contribute to climate action. We know that cultural participation builds social capital, both in individuals and communities. As I said earlier, communities are going to be what solves climate change, but also individual confidence, self-belief and use of language is crucial for an element of justice, of climate justice, where all parts of society are not only invited to participate in the difficult discussions about the future world we want to live in, but they also have the capabilities increased social capacity. They also have the capabilities increased by increased social capital to do so effectively. I think my time is more or less up. I started by saying why culture needs to be active on climate change and also why climate action needs culture. I spoke about the importance of the stories that we all tell ourselves and each other and how these shape us, society and culture. A society that needs to change radically from the culture of consumption that causes climate change. I provided some very basic advice about how to think internally about carbon reduction and adaptation. And this advice is more about asking questions of ourselves about who we are, what we do and why we do it, than about technical carbon literacy. Asking these questions of yourselves, your staff, your freelancers and audiences will start you on the journey of telling different stories about yourselves and the society we want and need to be in the future. Thank you for listening.